It's the height of the summer, but there is no better time to start thinking about the winter farm and what you're going to do for the winter farm and when you're going to start it. So today, that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about. This is around the time that you want to start taking action for your winter crops if you're going to grow into the winter. And there's a number of things I'm going to talk to you guys about specifically. First thing I want to talk about is crops and which crops work the best. So there's obviously going to be some variability to this depending on the place in the world that you live. I'm in a zone 6B, and the crops that work well for me over the winter out of the types of crops that I grow. So if you know my farm, you know that I grow a select group of things. I don't grow everything, but I have grown a lot of crops over the years. Kale works really well over the winter. Spinach works well over the winter. Lettuce works okay. Arugula works okay. Red Russian kale works okay. And number 6, carrots, they work great. So I'm going to kind of break down the nuances of each of these going into the winter and when you want to start them if you're going to do it. There's a number of factors that you need to consider when you're going to plant into the winter, and I'll go through each of those. But first thing, I just want to kind of set up my context a little bit. When I'm talking about winter farming, I'm talking about planting crops in the ground and then putting either a low tunnel or a caterpillar tunnel over top of them, so they're unheated. And the basic idea here is that I'm going to establish the crop now in the summer going into the winter so that I can keep that crop alive throughout the winter. So really the only thing that's going to work here are really cold tolerant crops. The crops that I'm going to do personally are spinach and carrots and lettuce. The other ones I won't do going into the winter, though I will push them really far into the fall. So the thing that is the first and most important factor to understand when you're going to plant a winter farm is understanding your days to maturity and how your days from your summer solstice to your fall equinox and fall equinox to the winter solstice get exponentially shorter. So it's really important to understand, and you need to understand your season and your climate a little bit on how your sort of weather patterns, if you will. So for example, so we're August 4th today. Within the next week, I'm going to be doing my last planting of carrots. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at a time in the fall, and I'm picking a time based on my observations. So for us, by about mid-October, it starts to get noticeably cool. I mean, it's starting to get cool nights all up until then, but we still get relatively warm days. So I pick a time frame, so I'm going to say the second week of October. That's when it starts to get cool, and that's when crops will no longer really grow the way that they would during a time like now in the summer. So I'm going to pick that time, and then I'm going to take my crop like carrots, and I'm going to count backwards from my days to maturity. So I'm going to count about 60 to 70 days, maybe 70 days. Like in the summertime, if I plant carrots in July 1st, say, can pretty much have them in 60 days. And that would be varieties like Mokum or Nelson, relatively quick growing carrots. So I'm growing the same varieties, and I'm going to count backwards from that day. So if I count back from the second week of October and I go back 2 months and maybe 10 days, I arrive at about now. So I need to be starting to plant those carrots around now. And that's the main understanding. So that's a longer season crop. So that's how I arrive at that last planting date. So if you're thinking about planting spinach in the winter, right now, August 4th, you don't have to worry about it. You would start thinking a little bit further ahead. You know, if you're going to do a fall crop, it might be in September, and if you're going to do a winter crop, I can plant overwintered spinach sometimes the second week of October, put a poly low tunnel over it or a caterpillar tunnel, and that's a different strategy to have it mature by early spring. But if I want crops for the winter, I'm going to start basically doing the same thing, counting backwards from that last cold day, or the first of the cold days, I should say, counting backwards to my days to maturity. Now for irrigating winter crops, you don't really need to irrigate when it's cold, especially if it's an unheated greenhouse or polytunnel. You really only need to water to establish the crops. My general rule of thumb is if it's 10 degrees Celsius or colder, you don't need to water, unless of course the soil looks bone dry and you can visibly tell that the crop needs water. My strategy when I'm establishing a winter crop or overwintered crop is to make sure that it's watered a lot during the warm season like it is now to get that crop established. And then once I get into October, I don't really need to water anymore. So at that point, I'm often disconnecting my irrigation systems then anyways, and just stop. I just don't water. And you know, if there's the odd day, say it's a mid-October day and it's really sunny and it's in the greenhouses and it's really warm in there, maybe I'll go in and I'll turn the water on, or I might hand water those crops for a period. But that's my general rule of thumb there. Now, another really important key factor to consider is shade. For any of us in the northern or southern hemispheres, the direction or the placement of the sun changes quite drastically throughout our seasons, and as we approach winter, our sun lowers in the sky. So for example, I'm standing behind a tree, and this tree is actually on the south side of this plot, but it is a deciduous tree, and the tree will shed most of its foliage going into the fall, so it's not so much of an issue for me here. But there are other issues, like even specifically with my urban context where the sun is. So I've got shade obstructions pretty much all around this plot. I have a big house on the west side, I have a big house on the east side. So if I'm going to put crops in this plot for the winter, I'm generally going to target the center beds so that that's the place where they get the most amount of sun. The tree on the south actually isn't so much of an issue here because it's deciduous. If it was an evergreen tree, then I wouldn't plant there in the winter because it would be casting a really long shadow in here. But it's not so much of an issue right now. Another thing to consider, and it's not so much of an issue for me in an urban context, but for those of you who are farming rurally, is to understand your prevailing winds. And if you've established a farm, that's probably something that you would have looked at the beginning, but it is important to understand how prevailing winds change throughout the seasons, and where you place certain crops, they could be affected by those prevailing winds. So you want to understand where those winds come from in the winter and the summer, and if the winds change in the winter, and say you're going to put a crop in an area that's very exposed during those winter prevailing winds, you might want to reconsider that. So that's another one that's really important. The last thing that I consider when I'm going to establish a crop or crops into the winter is where I place my tunnels and how close they are placed to one another. So for example, if I was going to put poly-low tunnels here, and so for those of you who aren't familiar with poly-low tunnels, I've done videos on that, but it's also in my book. They are little tunnels that cover two 30-inch beds. And a problem that I've made many times, and this is why I'm sharing this with you, so to save you the trouble, is in the winter, or going into winter, I wasn't really thinking about the placement of where I'd put those beds, because it's just like, okay, plant them wherever, and then get the tunnels up when they're needed. The problem is if you put up a poly-low tunnel here to say cover these two beds, these two lettuce beds, and then you put a poly-low tunnel on the next two beds, and there's only a walkway between those two tunnels, if you get snow, it's going to be a disaster for you, because the snow is going to pile up in that center and it's going to collapse in the tunnels. So for poly-low tunnels, even caterpillar tunnels, I always leave at least one bed empty between those tunnels, and then what you can do is put a cover crop in that bed, because it is going to get a lot of water on it, because it's between two tunnels. The half of those tunnels is going to be shedding water into there, and that means that you could potentially erode that soil more than you want to. So if you were to put up a caterpillar tunnel that was going to cover 4 beds, leave one bed empty, put a cover crop into that bed, and then put another caterpillar tunnel next to it. And that would be the same for poly-low tunnels. Okay, the last thing I want to add is thinking about what your harvest needs are. And you know, the nice thing about establishing winter greens, say, or even winter carrots or other types of root vegetables, is that once the weather gets cold, the crops aren't consistently growing. When we're thinking about crop succession in the summertime, it's planting every single week, and we've got a consistent succession. But when the days get cool, you can start to plant things in batches. So for example, right now I'm planting 2 beds of lettuce every week, 2 to 4 beds of arugula every week, 2 beds of radishes. Right now I'm planting some summer spinach, so I'm planting 2 beds of spinach. Going into the winter, it wouldn't be that same strategy at all. I would actually plant batches. So I could plant 8 beds of lettuce at once. I could plant 8 beds of spinach, 8 beds of carrots, because I'm not worried that if I harvest 2 of those beds of lettuce one week, that the next week, the next 2 are going to be way overgrown, because once you get into winter, things just kind of stagnate. They just sit there. If the crop is cold tolerant enough that it can handle, you know, we get -10, sometimes -20 Celsius up here in the winter, and the crops that I grow during the winter can handle that if they're in a greenhouse, like a sheltered, unheated greenhouse, then they're just going to sit there in stasis. So it's almost like having just a predetermined or preset amount of crop that just sit there in storage, and you take what you need when you need it. So that's the nice thing about winter farming. But basically what you want to do is just think about what your needs are. So how many beds of each crop do I want to harvest per week? So you might say, okay, my main field production is going to be officially shut down by about the first week of November. So counting from there, how many beds of each of this crop do I want to harvest each week? And then basically plant according to your needs. So, you know, you might not, like for example, lettuce here, I might be able to push that to Christmas if I'm lucky, but I won't be able to get it too far. I can do it in the heated greenhouse, but things like spinach and kale and carrots, I can keep in the ground all winter as long as they're covered. So essentially just going to think about what my needs are and when I want to harvest. And the last thing I want to add is some crops, they can survive really cold weather. Like my spinach and my carrots and kale even can survive -20 in the winter, but I can't necessarily go out and harvest them when it's -20. I have to wait for windows of opportunity, because spinach is a neat one, and kale do the same thing actually. Is you might see a day where it's -20 Celsius. You go in the greenhouse and you go, oh wow, it's, you know, it looks almost dead, like it's kind of laid down. But then you'll get a sunny day, and in your greenhouse it might go up to 5 degrees Celsius, and you'll see that stuff kind of spruce up. So that's when you want to be harvesting. You don't want to be harvesting the crops when they're limp and they look kind of shocked by the cold. So those are my tips for getting your winter farm ready. Hope you guys have found that helpful. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more stuff like that, and check out my courses. I'm going to be teaching workshops in a few different places this year. Stay up to date with my website, and check out the resource section on my website that now lists all the equipment that I use. Talk to you guys later.